Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CDCT Live, Automate with a Purpose. I'm Jason Rader. I'll be your host today. And with me, we have Jeff Bozick, Principal Architect, Jonathan Parnell, JP, our Senior Consultant, and Jake Lumberg, Special Guest. He's the Field CTO for HashiCorp. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
So, automation, where do we start with that? I think, I'm excited. We conversed a little bit before we got started. How do you automate with purpose? Why don't you get us started kind of on the ecosystem, if you will, Jake?
Oh, wow. Automation with purpose. I think the first thing is to really understand what it is that you're trying to do from a go-to-market strategy with automation in the first place, right? So it sounds weird to go back to Business 101 and just figure out what you're trying to do. What I've noticed with the automation side of things is that some of the dangers in it are that you have the ability to automate anything that you want, and you can kind of like release anything into the wild. We see this with people leaking credentials out to Bitcoin miners. They can literally make a bunch of money off from that very quickly. And so I think the first thing is figure out what it is that you're trying to do from a goals perspective by saving time and coming to market faster. And then also make sure that you're understanding where your policy guidelines are, so that when you release things out in an automated fashion, you don't produce other dangers to your company. So again, I think just the high level again is just figure out where you get the greatest gains, and apply a set of policies towards that automation framework to make sure that you're protecting your company.
I love that you started with kind of Business 101, because I think a lot of folks start with coding immediately and release that stuff out. Jeff, JP, what do you guys think? Does that, when you're talking to clients out there doing what you do you think that, do they typically jump to the business aspects, or are they jumping straight to the mechanics of what they want to get going?
They're definitely jumping to the mechanics. I think one of the things that just clients need to distill within themselves and areas that we can help is, automation is a broad term. And when you think about, a cloud native pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline, a modern pipeline, whatever that looks like, from, all the way from the business side of saying, what do I want to provide to my clients, all the way to actually deploying something, there's automation about that entire pipeline. And different groups are going to be responsible for different pieces of that. Sometimes it will traverse groups. But I think really understanding, what are we even referring to when we colloquially just say automation? And to Jake's point, start to understand, why would I automate, to even understand kind of where does it make sense? I think for the most part, when we're talking about Insight Cloud and data center clients, it's a lot of infrastructure teams, private clouds, even into hybrid, where a lot of it's around infrastructure as code. And yeah, I think the biggest mistakes that we see are people not necessarily understanding, why am I doing this? They think they're trying to catch up, and really understanding the value of what this is supposed to provide. And if I want to start moving faster and safer, then automating my existing processes probably doesn't make sense. You take a lot for granted of just your day-to-day tasks as you start to think about automation and what does that actually mean. So really understanding the full processes, and then start to understand that value. And I think Jake's so right. I mean, starting with the answer of why, then you start to get into how, and then you can start to figure out, what. But I think, just really starting to nail down where are we even talking about the value, and then how do we want to think about moving forward? Automation is kind of that run phase. So how do we figure out what that crawl and walk is to even begin to know when to start to run?
Yeah, and I fully agree with both of them, right? And I kind of look at it in a few different dimensions. I think people confuse automation with orchestration. Automation is very much about a set of repetitive tasks. Orchestration is about a lot of tasks, working together to have an outcome. So if you look at usually what happens is people focus on an outcome of automation, but don't ask, can a process automate us? Can a person automate us? Can a tool automate us? And then second to that, in terms of orchestration, why doesn't my automation go past security? Well, you can't just build something to impact someone else without talking about what it happens, what it does to someone else. So, there's a lot of good intent, but it's not thought about in the terms of the ecosystem, and there's not enough conversation that happens across these silos to actually make it a reality, right? So a lot of times, that's kind of where it starts. Someone wants to, like to Jeff's point, let's automate, but what's the outcome? We're trying to go faster. Well, why? Are you missing something? Do you need something? Because usually automation happens by subtraction, right? The less things you can minimize and control in simple form is how allows you to go faster, right? So there's a lot of techniques to automate that people don't quite understand because they're not looking at the outcome. And so very few times it starts on the business side, but we try to get them, back over there and get those decisions made there.
Well, with that being said, and I probably should have led with this stat. We did a survey, Insight CDCT did a cybersecurity survey last year. It ended up in December. We launched it in Q1. And in it, we surveyed, director level and higher with IT and security, leaders within these organizations, a couple hundred of them. And the number one thing that they said was holding them back from being where they wanted to be from a security posture perspective was automation. So IT and security automation, they felt were their biggest barrier. And so I just did a CIO conference yesterday, and that was brought up again. Like CIOs, so we're talking at the business level, are saying automation is the thing that we need. So with that being said, and now we have all different types that are going to watch this. And when we've got the business leaders and they go back and say, yeah, how do I get me some of that automation? How do we distill that down into something that we can make into the business thing, Jake?
Sorry, I was muted. Again, I think that, Jonathan made a great point about, what is it that we're actually getting from this automation? There's a difference between just automation for automation's sake and wrapping that back into whatever that purpose is, right? So there's a goal behind automation, and usually that's to make something happen faster, right? And that's where the clouds are great. AWS is fantastic. All the rest of the clouds, followed suit and produced a lot of great tools. But the concept is that I, as a developer or an operations person or something like that, can think up this environment that I want to create and very easily go out and do that thing, right? And very quickly get to market with that. And again, I think that that's the goal, right? I want to get to market faster. I want to increase security. I want to decrease toil for my developers and whatnot. But these are a lot of people miss out on when they're actually doing the automation. They're optimizing for speed to market, and that's almost always the reason that folks are doing the automation side of things. But there are dangers there, and we see examples of this all the time, right? So some of the best companies out there, Capital One, for instance, is very, very great at automating their environments, but they made a small policy mistake in the fact that they left an S3 bucket open and then didn't have encryption of their data. And so policies of that, which helps us protect our brand and what it is that we're doing from the automation side of things. And I highly encourage folks as they start to really dive deep into automation frameworks, especially in the clouds, or be it in Kubernetes or anywhere for that matter, to take a very, very close look at what they're trying to do for their brands and take that brand management in account. Because once you have a breach or once you make a mistake inside of the networks there, it's very hard to build that social capital back up and gain trust from your users again. And so again, it's not just the speed to market that helps to increase your engagement with your customers and consume your products. It's really that trust level of things. And that's where I think we're starting to see a lot more focus on the policy management side of things, like make sure that my S3 buckets aren't open to the world, and that you have those checks against the automation frameworks that you have. And so again, one of the sort of things that I've really started to resonate with my customers is this concept of work and policy. And so we're very good at automating the work, right? So that's the thing that, you put that into the code and it goes off and it does the thing and hey, we're to market faster and oops, I left my S3 bucket open and now I'm on the news, right? The part that we're not really getting great at is that policy side of things, making sure that the expertise that we have as, say I was a systems administrator for a long time. I have lots of things that I don't do as a systems administrator when I, put a server into a rack. I make sure I have power and then I have the right networking and that cooling is okay and things like that, right? Those intrinsic policies are things that we can also turn into code. And so What are you see this with like Sentinel within the Terraform side of things, or OPA within the general open source policy frameworks, really starting to get into that concept of making sure that your policies are defined well before your automation is done.
I love that. And so that, again, kind of takes us back up to a business level conversation. And I think JP had mentioned something earlier as well about the silos that happen within a business. Mm-hmm. So I noticed that as well when I go out and talk to clients. There's this overarching governance that we want to put into place. However, there are a bunch of silos, and getting those guys to kind of coordinate together is a part of a big culture shift that has to happen within the organization to be effective. How do you, I assume you can't automate that, but what are some of the techniques or what experiences that you've got related to helping folks that way?
Yeah, again, it sounds. I know we're for folks who are techies and they're looking for the answer of like, "Hey, what's the tool that I should be using in order to do these?" The focus that we typically find is that getting to market fast is easy, right? These conversations of what it is that you're trying to do for your brand, especially for those customers that you're working with, is very different from customer to customer, right? So they have varying levels of objectives of things they're trying to do. Are they trying to increase communication between their internal development folks? Are they trying to shift their security practices, towards the development practices or something like that? And what are the end goals of doing that? Almost everything that we do is for making money, right? So most all of us are for-profit companies, but there's even not-for-profit companies that are out there that are trying to maintain their brand. They're trying to increase their engagement with their customers. And so again, when it comes to like these things, like me as a systems administrator, I have a task, and that's to deploy some kind of compute resources for the applications that we have. But it's what those applications do and how they communicate with the other applications and the development pipelines and all the rest of that stuff that is so very, very important. And again, I think that, the barriers that I've seen, even from my own experience in doing automation, from cloud to Kubernetes to, whatever frameworks that are out there, is that if you only think about things at the technological level, sooner or later, you're going to run into a business problem, right? And so I think the holistic approach of like getting those higher level managers involved with the decision-making process and really informing them what's happening with the feedback loops, properly understanding that, yes, I am furthering my business objectives and I'm not causing some kind of risk in my environments. And I think that's the most important thing that I've seen with the transition with a lot of customers that are out there, because I've seen a lot of like automation efforts fail. And usually where they fail is because they're not aligned to some kind of business process that's out there.
Yeah.
And so,
Jason,
I mean, go ahead. Sorry, Jay.
Yeah, and you kind of are leading into the response I wanted for Jason's answer, right? You have to put the responsibility back on the business to understand what they're asking for. Yeah. So one of the questions Bozic and I ask a lot is, "That's great. How does this automation impact your top or bottom line?"
Yeah.
You can't answer that. Then how do you know that this thing won't affect that in a negative way? Oh, you don't have information. You need information to automate, right? Automation is all about how quickly can I make the right decision in my organization. Nothing to do with the tool, right? And they miss that whole thing. So you see, we had a DevOps automation program for 2 years and it slowed us down. Well, of course it did. I mean, like, how could it not? You're not acting upon the right information. So if you look at why security, they say, let's automate security. Well, of course, but security touches every information point in your organization. Am I secure? So you have to start with that policy. And the good thing, we got certain tools that can take a policy, right, and then automate the policy. That's kind of where you have to start, right? So we can talk about all these other things, but really it has to be secured. And I think now you're hearing that more now, Jason, because you have all these automations that are now impacting security even more. And they're like, we need security to do more. And security's like, hey, like, this is my job. Like, you can go in a lot of trouble if I just let this thing go. So this is very specific time, I think, in the point of where we're at, where you see that happening. And I think that's the right discussion point to start having and why you see these things start moving. And I think that also, if you truly understand, and if you look at, let's see, once you get past that point, right, we're going to do policies first. The very next step that you usually run into 9 times out of 10 is this. Automation is a first-class citizen of architectural discipline. If you have the right things that you can architect and pull and push, then it all goes. But what happens is people look at certain like IAC tools and they don't understand they don't have 12-factor apps as a standard. They don't have test automation as a standard. And they wonder why they can't automate. Well, you have to have the table stakes, right? You can't just automate around skipping things. And so the second question I asked businesses, I was like, I would just flat out tell them is your automation making up for a step you're skipping in business decisions, right? Because it's not going to work. So again, those two kind of question sets, you put it back on them, they start thinking, it's like, okay, all right. Then you start really getting into the weeds of what it actually means for them and some of the low-hanging fruit that you can instantiate to get things actually moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there's, I'd like to add to that if I don't mind. There's two interesting things that we're kind of synergizing on here. And one is that a common belief and focus of automation is speed to market. I can save money by doing things faster. I might not need as much overhead of my precious resources. If I can get to market faster, then hopefully I can increase top line. Speed and the potential revenue impact are somewhat measurable and especially speed is relatively easily measurable. If you can then break that down into man hours, they know how much they're spending for man hours. You can break that down into overhead costs relatively easily. What you cannot codify easily or even quantify easily is risk. And I think that's why we see that being the biggest attribute around automation that isn't really thought about, and really where a lot of JP and I's conversations focus to that client is how are you increasing your risk profile? Because if you're not securing things and all you're doing is moving faster, you are now just proliferating your risk. You're not decreasing it. And the funny thing is the whole point of DevOps is to move faster, safer. Well, then you're not doing anything safer. In fact, you're again decreasing your safety. So how do you start to JP's point and Jake's point, help break down these responsibilities of security? Things like test automation become really critical. Going back to the point earlier of, what do you actually mean when you say automation? Because there's automation everywhere along that pipeline. And I think for the most part, especially around infrastructure teams, you're colloquially just talking about infrastructure as code, but test automation becomes a critical piece of that. If you're using Terraform, you have things like TerraTest that can start to test your code, test the endpoints. How do you start to test, the readiness of those things? And then going back to that process map is part of the other risk profile that people don't understand is, I think way too many admins and engineers take for granted how many decisions their brains actually make whenever they manually perform a task. And let's just talk about a basic provisioning of a web server or something. Even the basic things of resource utilization, if let's say I'm in a traditional VMware land, I'm seeing the amount of available space in that data store. And I know typically how big this VM is going to be. I see how much RAM is on that machine. And it's just so second nature. You don't even think about the fact that you are making that decision. And then, there's the security pieces. There's the ports that need to be opened. And these are decisions that you're oftentimes making. If you realize that there's not enough capacity, or you realize that these firewall ports aren't open, you're going to go work with that team to manually. Well, as you start to automate, all of these things have to happen. All these validations that you just do have to happen. Those validations become part of these test harnesses that you create. And so way too often those things get missed, they get forgotten about. To JP's point, it takes time to do that. It's not just immediate. You're now spending time coding against things that aren't producing like a fun output that you can see that's doing something cool. So they get forgot quite a bit. And this to me is the biggest challenge of getting folks to understand what successful automation is and not get yourself into the situation of Jake's client there with unprotected S3 buckets.
Yeah, just and Jason, you may have a question here, but I just wanted to hop in and talk through something I thought was really interesting about what JP was saying, and that's really about observability. And there's a tremendous amount of, I was guilty of this as an admin, right? So you want to get the thing out there, and you get it out to market, and then something breaks, and you go, "What the hell broke?" And it's like, well, as Jeff said, the human scheduler, went out there and forgot to test that there was enough disk space for this endpoint or something like that. And it always feels like observability comes after your automation, right? So you created this cool thing, you're running fast, and then the thing breaks, and then oh yeah, we should probably see what's going on with the system, right? And that's at the technical level of things. But and I hate to bring the conversation back to the boring stuff that's out there, but the concept of like an SLI, like a service level indicator, or KPI, the key performance indicators that are out there in these environments, help us understand that whatever it is that we're trying to do is doing what it is that we desired, right? So I can't measure, and if I don't have data for that thing that I'm trying to observe, then I literally it's a infinite realm of possibilities of whatever it is that could be going on there. And so I just wanted to touch on that, JP. Like you talked about observability in a way, but I think you have to add into that also not just the SLI side of things, but also the KPI side of things. Is it that I'm actually doing something better for my business? Am I getting the market faster? Am I being protected in my environment? So absolutely, I totally agree with that.
So Jake, you mean my gut feel that what I did add value isn't good?
But Jake, I'm glad you said that.
I mean, I trust your instincts, Jeff. I know you're a professional, but there's it's that. Because it's either you trust something or you don't, right? But I think the verification step, that's where the metrics and all the rest of that stuff comes in, right? I want to verify that whatever it is that I say that I do. Our CRO, Brandon Sweeney, he says he's always saying that, I want to see a high say-do ratio. You don't know what you did until you measure it, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those points up, Jake, and I'm sure Jason had more questions, but I think this is a really good segue into something I wanted to bring up, right? If you look at what Jake is saying and you look at automation, right? The very first thing you generally do once we get to that, project start point, you have to identify technical debt, because you could get to automation by removing enough debt as well, right? And if you can start with that, that's a big thing. But what Jake said is important, right? There's, the SLAs, the service level agreements between, right? There's the SLOs, what's the objective of it? The SLI is how you're measuring it. And the KPIs, of course. But what most people miss are the OKRs. Like the KPIs are like the speed at which your car is going. The OKR is like your GPS. So you say, we want KPIs. We're like, well, let's talk about OKRs first. And once you kind of pivot them into objective thinking versus speed thinking, they're in a mental mode, a mental model now where they can start receiving more of the information we're trying to give them, right? This is the objective. These are steps. We don't have to automate everything. So that's a really key point that Jake brought up. And you can get to observability simply by reducing technical debt and like putting some systems in place, right? So it's a very, very key point. So Jake, thanks for bringing that up.
No.
So we talked about what are the techie folks out there? Where's their place in all this? Because I think when we talk a lot about automation, there's some infrastructure folks that might feel like they're left out of the game. Maybe there's other aspects. What do we want? How did these guys get engaged into this conversation? Because if we're, I think we've said things like risk and business aspects and all kinds of other things that those guys typically aren't in that conversation. How do the tech folks engage in this?
I think one of them is just showing the desire to want to work better together for that common goal. I think it was JP or maybe Jake mentioned it earlier of, if we can align everyone to the goal of the organization, what are the outcomes that the organization is looking for? That starts to remove some of the even, quote unquote personal, but more like group to group kind of infighting. There's traditionally been some infighting of, the infrastructure folk think, developers are prima donnas. Developers think that infrastructure folk are just, staunch, hard-nosed, geeks. And so if we can start to remove some of these, and then, security is just the folks that say no to everything. The irony, though, is everybody has the right intent. And so we can start to align the fact that these groups now all have the same outcome. And start to realize that we're all marching to the same beat. And although to IT, your customer now becomes the developer, that's okay, because that is your path to adding value to your clients. And they're not making decisions because they want to. They're not, in some room just like, how can we make everyone's lives harder? Or I'm going to go try this new microservice pattern because it sounds cool and interesting. They're being asked by the business to, provide feature sets and value faster to their clients to make their infrastructure safer, their data safer, so that there's no breaches, increasing their security posture as things become more disparate. So I think, one of those things is aligning to the organizational objectives. And then, this concept of cross-functional teams becomes, really important of actually getting people together. Once you start to get actual human beings together in a room and realize that there's this kinship, this alignment, fascinating things start to happen. I mean, we even see that inside of our organization. That's inside of every organization. And then, ultimately, especially as you start thinking about test automation, how can I make things safer? The concept of distributed responsibilities with security become really interesting. But the security team still ultimately is responsible for securing the infrastructure, securing the data, securing access, securing environment, securing the business. So in some way, we have to sell to them, even though they have to realize that infrastructure is now becoming their client. Developers are becoming their client. Proving that, hey, we can actually take this on. Proving that your test harnesses are validating that, hey, only these ports are accessible, or only these firewalls are accessible, or these are my IAM roles, or my code is static, or these images are safe and secure. You don't have to scan those. I'll scan those as part of my test suites. Pair programming becomes interesting. Infrastructure guys don't like to program as it becomes part of infrastructure as code. There's a lot that they can learn from the developer side, both in terms of just, code stewardship. Automation becomes production. It becomes as production ready and valuable as the production code. It needs to be treated all the same. JP made that point earlier of, this all becomes, if you're all becoming kind of a software company. So starting to understand those principles, but then also there's a lot of things that group probably has already figured out within your organization. A lot of the cultural barriers, Jason, that you're talking about, dev and ops may have already worked through some of those and figured out how they can start to communicate better. How can I start to show better metrics? What is the business looking for? How can I even understand what those OKRs are? So starting to learn better from what everybody's working on. So it's not a real technical answer, but
let me interject real quick. So is there a thing, when I think of the security teams, when I think of the infrastructure teams, is there, and I'm going to pose this back to Jake, is there a platform clash that can potentially happen when we're all kind of aligning with different automation platforms, if we're not talking? When the boss came in, the CIO attended this cool conference with me.
Well, never know who's gonna come up with what. And again, sorry, my network is just going terribly right now. I'm literally watching my ping rates. Yeah, I'm watching my ping rates go up to like 2 seconds and stuff like that. So sorry for that. Anyways, there's something else that Jeff was talking about that I think is also important. And I used to be a bastard operator from hell, and I took pride in that. And the reason that I took pride in that is because the work that I was producing was, the intent of it was to protect my company from from a brand mismanagement, right? Yeah. In the grand scheme of things, your security folks, even though they're hard to deal with because they're always party of no, like, no, you can't do that. No. And it's like that helicopter parent who's like, just flying over you, making sure you don't make a mistake. But the reason that those people are so important to your organization is because they do protect you, right? And I think that the concept of capturing that person in code is, again, very, very important. And I think that's where the odds are. Because me, as that bastard operator from hell, I want to make sure that I'm protecting my company. Like, how do I produce code, much like Jeff was talking about how do I verify that whatever it is that I've done isn't going to harm my brand? And again, I think that's the automation piece of that we sort of leave by the wayside, is like, where are the protection mechanisms? Because all of our expertise is out there to produce the intent of what it is that we do. And so again, it's not just optimizing for speed, it's optimizing for that protection of the business and the protection of the brand. I think that's there. And I think once those folks, the old crunchy network guys, the purveyors of no, once they realize that what we're building is allowing us to capture their expertise in a way that protects our environments, I think that helps them get on board, right? So then become part of that policy management framework. And whether they're the ones who are writing the code or they're just advisors on the policy management framework, we're still taking their expertise and we're turning that into high quality work. And I think, again, that's where the cultural barriers typically come in, is that we want to leverage the expertise that we have in those folks who are maybe not automation friendly, and just making sure that we sort of codify their expertise.
Yeah, Jason. And so you mentioned culture, but it's like, I'm glad you said that, right? Because when we get into like the automation workshops and DevOps workshops, at the end of the day, it's the relationship conversation, right? If you're in a relationship, you have to say your boundaries, right? What are the boundaries to participate with me? And in your role, you have to integrate, you have to talk to different people in the business, right? And the first thing you want to start with is, what things do I need from them in what amount of time in order to do my job? And what things does someone else need from me in X amount of time to do their job? And then you can start with that kind of boundary, and you can be really focused on, okay, for this sprint or this month, there's 2 policies, right, that I have to address to automate for. And you just cherry pick them, right? But you have to start with the boundaries that you're operating in and the participation required for your role. So as a technical person, that's hard, right? Because you're just so used to getting requirements and out the door. But no, like, DevOps 101 is just that communication and trust, right? But culture is intentful, it's deliberate. And you have to, in the organization, start doing things like that. What's a social contract? Start creating visibility into these things. Getting mindful risk acceptance is really important. Like, people need to feel responsible for security. I mean, when I was a software engineer and I saw security in the sprints, I was like, nope. Like, nope, I don't want to do any of that. Are you kidding me?
Then no.
What, you didn't want all that stuff to shift left to you, JP? Or
no,
shifted
that's
all the stuff.
that's QA's problem. Are you kidding me? Like, but no, it's like, but when people started coming to us and saying, hey, like, we just need these 2 or 3 things to go faster. You don't have to solve the whole thing. And the next thing you know, a year later, you're like operating pretty well as a team. But you have to be deliberate in that, right? You can't just expect behavior to change. You have to put some of those like social contracts in. So it's a very small, analog, low-level tactic that pays in spades.
Well, I like that. But from a leadership perspective, this doesn't happen organically. It's got to have some leadership weight behind it. Like, somebody's got to champion this at a high level, because first of all, there's a lot of influence without authority that has to happen in general to make this work. Mm-hmm. But if those champions don't exist at the upper levels of the organization, leaving it up to everybody to do the right thing, you're often going to come up a little short. And I think that's why, so the leaders that are watching this, it's just as important for you to be on board with this culture change, because you can't really get automation to the degree that I think everybody expects it to be without that, what we're talking about, the social construct that has to exist.
Yeah, Jason, if for the most part, if you could summarize the theme of what most of us have been saying, is that if any group within IT or app dev or operations is not doing work to align to those business level outcomes, then this DevOps, whatever you want to call the transformation, likely will not work. Automation certainly will not work. Again, you might only be increasing risk or increasing technical debt or making things take longer if everyone is not understanding what the organizational goals are, what the outcomes are that you're trying to produce, and how those can align together. So, sorry, Jake, didn't mean to.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with you with everything y'all are saying. And I have one particular customer, and I won't name them because they probably don't want this broadcasted out there. But like they have a really, they have a center of excellence, and they have all these folks that are out there that are doing all these cool automation things. But there's a certain culture within the company that doesn't feel like that's even necessary. And most of those folks are kind of in the middle management layer of the company. So they have like kind of high level visionaries within their executive staff. And then they have these really capable technicians on the bottom end, but there's no buy off in the middle. And so as these projects start to have to get agreeing on what's being done, that's where the break. It sounds so weird because we're talking about automation. We're talking about, how do I get to market faster? How do I do these things right? And again, the alignment between the entire business, that what it is that you're doing from an automation standpoint, if it isn't understood all the way through the entire chain of the company for somebody who's trying to digitally transform themselves, it's going to fail. And I think that, again, I think, we're saying a lot of things like somebody probably came here and like, hey, I want to hear about Terraform. I want to hear about these things. But again, the challenges that I find is very, very little to do with the technicians who are adopting these technologies, because they're almost always very smart folks who just want to do the coolest thing, right? You give them a toy, they go, it's like the puppy, you give him a ball, he runs around the yard like 20 times, and it's great. It's fantastic. But unless I have a buy-in from somebody who's actually going to make this relevant, who's going to pay for it, right? Who's going to have the budget to make sure that we're doing things properly, that I have the right security measurements in place. Like if you don't have those things and that buy-off there, almost always these things are going to fail. And so, again, if you're out there trying to automate things and your boss is the problem, not saying go around your boss, but maybe find some other champions in other parts of the business that can help convince your boss that, hey, this is working in my business unit. Here's how it worked. Find those success organizations within your organization, and maybe use that as the incubator for how the rest of the business processes their automation tasks and their initiatives that are out there.
Yeah, Jason, and we see, I think one of the best moves I've seen over the past couple of years is CISOs moving into the role above CIO and CTO.
Yeah.
Right. That solves most of this stuff organizationally and helps protect you. So you saw what Netflix did, right? It's an incredible operational move organizationally, right? And look at what happened with that. So I think some of this is one of those chess moves, like you just have to change kind of the structure of leadership, right? There's so much to learn and it's moving so fast. Security with the amount of threats we have from other countries is just absolutely crazy. So you have to really address it in that organizational model. And I think too, one of the other things too that's interesting is I think about automation like this, right? You ever get on a bike and you have speed wobbles? Like going so fast, like you're not going to go any faster and get control. You have to slow down to speed up. Sometimes you get bigger tires on your bike and change some of the architecture out, and then you can go faster. But like if I have a speed wobble, the last thing I'm going to try to do is put a motor on the thing. You know what I mean? So like it's kind of some of that, and the business has to be, you don't have to have it all figured out, but you have to, the business has to be willing to create the space to do things the right way, right? And if that comes down from the top, that's another really good thing. Like protect your people, give them space, trust them a little bit, change a little bit of the operating model, whatever, incentives, whatever, right? But you have to give people the space to fix the pieces in order to go faster.
One of the things I like about that analogy, JP, is one of the concepts that we've talked about a couple times here, and you and I talk to customers about daily. I'm sure Jake does as well. Is okay. So let's say you do believe automation is the right path for you. Where do you start? Like, what do you automate? It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources, and so kind of to your bike example, if I want to make it go faster, I only have a certain amount of money and time that I can buy parts and get actually install them on this bike. So how do you know which one's going to make you go the fastest? Let's say you're in a race, and all of our organizations are in a race to get to your customers' hearts and minds faster than your competitor. So how do you know which thing should I change first? It's actually going to make the biggest amount of benefit to get me there. And so that's another area that we see missed quite a bit is, understanding that process map and actually the value of what any one of these automated workflows is going to provide, not only to the outcome of the business, but even just in terms of what you're trying to accomplish with that said task. So that's something that's often missed is, where do I start? I should just, in fact, we have an example, and Jake, like you, I'm not going to mention the company's name. But they were having a private cloud automation big program. They did not want our help in a lot of that. Let's help build that architecture of your pipeline. Understand what your process maps are. Understand to the business how can we work better to know what the requirements are, where value should be. And they spent like 6 months automating all these things, and they were super proud of it. And then they came back 6 months later and said no one's using it. And it's like, well, yeah. So, did you actually do anything of value to the business? Well, no.
Yeah. Also, to Bozik's point, the other mistake that we see made is people think they can hire a bunch of people and build all this automation, but if you don't have information flow or documentation, you're going to slow your business down. There's only so much cognitive load that you can handle just throwing people at it, and you're like, you can't do that, right? So.
I think that's back to the capability maturity model that I kind of always use.
And I hate to pick on the managers again and again and again here, but when I look at automation problems, at least in my past from things that I've solved with automation, I like to use the golfing or fishing analogy, right? So like if I were to trade some amount of time in my day where I'm doing something manually, so that I could replace that with automation, so I could get on the golf course or get on the lake or whatever that thing is, or mow the lawn or whatever that task is that I have to do. Like, what are those things? Right. And then that's the time-based access of it. And then the other side of it is really that danger side. Like, where are the places that I make the most mistakes, that when I, as a human, am doing something that are going to, they're going to cause some kind of, downside to the business, or it's just like, I'm going to get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning and then I'm not going to make my, my tea time, or whatever it is that you think is like those motivations to reap the free time back. Now, it's a fallacy, because usually what ends up happening is like you get that time and then you just spend it doing other things. You're automating something else or something along those lines. But again, the concept is like, how do I free up that time for the extra 5 minutes a day or 10 minutes or an hour or something like that, because I'm doing the same thing over and over again. Like it's sort of like the don't repeat yourself, ethos within like the Python community. What I've noticed is that like if I'm doing that same thing over and over again, that's an automation task, right? That's exactly the thing. If I'm making mistakes doing something, those are automation tasks. Those are the things that I focus on to free up my time to use my expertise in other ways. And this comes back, Jason, you sort of answered this question. I didn't really answer because we'd gone into another direction. But that's really like, how do you pick the things to use as your tool set? And it's very easy for me as a HashiCorp employee, because our ethos of workflows, not technology, means that we take lots of different technologies and enable you to automate them through those means. Whether it's Terraform or Console or whatever tool that we have, or any tools for that matter, the concept is try to get the most breadth out of your tooling that allows you the most flexibility. Programming language in which lots of people can understand things if you decide to use that. Like one of the I have a history degree. I'm not a comp sci guy, believe it or not. So I don't have a background of like really excellent code building. And so for me, the easiest way is probably the best way. And I hated CloudFormation. And that's literally how I came to Terraform, is I just hated CloudFormation. And I was looking at like, Python, scripting with, what's the, forget the tool name that we were using at the time. But, we did all this like scripting stuff of making CloudFormation work for us. And then I saw Terraform and I'm just like, dude, this is so easy. Like I presented it to a guy, and it's funny, we talked about this person earlier, and that's the resistor, the bastard operator from Hill that used to do things by hand. And like, they love that, doing things manually. I showed one of these guys Terraform, and he like picked it up, and now he is like a DevOps guy, and there's a lot of other things within DevOps that's more than just the code itself, obviously from a discipline perspective, but it shifted from this like very hands-on physical person to now being able to automate the framework, because the tool was easy enough for them to use, that it was powerful enough that they could understand that they can show things with words. And again, it's just find the tooling that works within the organization, that like gives you the most amount of power, the most amount of flexibility, and gets the buy-in from the folks that are there. Because again, that's usually where where that friction point happens. Is like you have somebody like we had this guy who's big in the CF engine, and that was like well after like Puppet and Chef and all that stuff had come along. But he was like huge into promise theory, so he just stuck to CF engine, and nobody wanted to use that platform because it was hard to work with. And then we brought Puppet into our environment, and like everybody loved it and they used it, and that tool allowed us to excel a lot better because there was buy-in. It fit for everybody on the team. It was a good cultural fit. So again, back to kind of what you're asking, like how do you find that proper tooling? Just got to look around and experiment with it once or twice. Pick not the dumbest guy, and the most resistant person to automation on your team. Pick the tool that person's willing to use, probably, and that's how you're going to get ahead. Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of good points there, Jake, and I'm glad you brought a few of them up. So I love dry, right? There's kind of two: dry, don't repeat yourself. But the other one's really important: KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid. Mm-hmm. It's really important. And it's the other expression: don't let a tool make you a tool. So like. It's important though, right? Because a tool scales a solution. It doesn't solve your problem, right? And so that's what happens. Is like there's a problem set that's not solved yet, and people get these tools to try to solve the problem. It's like it doesn't work that way. You should pick a tool when you are at the point of optimization that you can no longer scale that solution, right? Then you pick it. Like I love how Jake talked about the progression of that, right? The way they were solving that problem set, they kept getting to a solution, and the right tool came to extend that solution. It wasn't, we're just going to use this to go solve these problems. I think it's a very important thing that we implement in tool rationalization, right? You have to show the problem is solved and how this scales a solution. If your problem's not solved, we generally won't allow you to pick that tool yet, right? And so that's kind of some of the discipline stuff I was talking about that you can do without having, this huge governing body and stuff. But thanks for bringing that up too, Jake.
Yeah, the only thing I'll tag onto that might be useful to some of our viewers is, we often see teams jumping to tools first, thinking that tools are the solution, tools are going to solve their problem. We're not the first to say it, but I think hopefully it won't be the last. Tools are not your solution. To JP's point, they're the enabler. To Jake's point, I mean, they're what's going to allow you to do this. Finding ones that are easy, that can enable your team to do what they want to do in a more efficient manner. But if your organization already has gone down the path of investing in tools first, the worst thing I think you can do is try to wedge the tool into the process that you believe and the operating model that you believe is going to make the most value for your organization, your culture, and the outcomes you're trying to produce. It's way better to build, quote unquote technical debt of a tool that might start becoming shelfware than creating a bunch of risky deployments or deployments that might have to be pulled back or spending a bunch of time doing things that aren't of value, missing steps because you're trying to use a tool that you've already invested in. Having two tools is okay. In fact, sometimes, automation is a great example. I mean, very few times it's just like the one tool, the thing that's going to automate all the things, even within an infrastructure team. So don't be beholden to the tools you have. Use them until they cannot be used anymore, whether it's because they can't scale anymore, because they can't provide the feature set anymore, because they're creating too much overhead, they don't bridge the gap between teams, whatever that might be. Let the tool support what you're trying to do. Don't fit what you're trying to do to, fit the tools that you have and invest in it.
Yeah, and there's two really good points there. So it's more important to actually put the right process in place to rationalize a tool versus picking the specific tool, because these things are going to keep proliferating super fast. And you can't stop every quarter and have this, this long bloated discussion around every tool. So that's like a big kind of CI thing that you can put in place. How do we rationalize tools? But it goes back to Jake's point. You need observability. You have to be able to prove that tool is not going to impact or too many things. So again, if you don't have that process to rationalize, you don't have observability to make the intelligent decision. Back to the point of automation is more about how quickly we can make the right decision. You're going to constantly be up against the same conversation, right? I mean, HashiCorp's pushing a lot of cool stuff out that we love, and it's like every time it happens, you can't just have to stop and have a conversation around it. You have to have data. Here's some information. We can make a decision, right? And that's really important to put in place for organizations, just to not let the same thing happen every single quarter.
I love it. And guys, we're probably at time, but I wanted to ask one more question to Jake. So we've talked about a lot of cool stuff. From your perspective, where is automation going?
Well, there's clearly a very heavy draw towards orchestration. This is the different kind of orchestration that what JP was talking about, whether it's Kubernetes or sort of Nomad or something along those lines. The drive for like containerizing and allowing developers to check in their code and have it deployed. Like I think that's the sort of holy grail of what's out there. You see that in some of the development of like tools like we've created called was a huge initiative by our developers to help solve the problems that our developers were having in getting our applications to market. It's clearly a major sticking point for how people do. We see this with a lot of the supply chain stuff. So Google released this thing called Salsa, which is like a supply chain sort of management framework. And what we're starting to see within that is like we have to be very cognizant of controlling and protecting all of our assets from the code all the way to the deployment area of that thing, right? Because, I still eat beef. I'm not a vegetarian yet, and the fact that the largest beef producer in the world lost a bunch of capacity because of a supply chain issue, that's a huge issue, right? The pipeline shutdown for Colonial was a giant issue because there are these gaps within our environments, and so back to the protection and the brand preservation side of things is like I think that the holy grail is how do I both allow my developers to push a button and get their code out to their customers very, very quickly, but make sure that's done in a protected and controlled manner. I think that's the very large set of focuses that they have. And the other piece of it too is just that the concept of moving from the protection mechanisms that they have to very highly identity-driven systems, right? So we see this with a lot of the zero trust talk that's going out there. And I think that almost everybody that we talk to on a day-to-day basis is like, how do I protect my assets? Again, and even down to the human interaction elements. If something breaks, if I have to break glass, how do I make sure that my humans are able to access things in ways that don't open them up to nefarious actors looking to mine Bitcoin in your IR? So, anyways, that's what I think is the biggest focus out there.
I love it. Jake, it's been a pleasure having you as our special guest today. Thanks for coming. And of course, Jeff and JP, you guys rock. Thanks for joining us. If you guys would like more information about what we talked about today, please visit us at CDCT or insightcdct.com. And again, thanks to HashiCorp for letting Jake spend some time with us. You guys rock.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.